I'm gonna set this thing off here. I think I'm gonna knock it over. Well, the bad news is that I think my presentation was supposed to end about 20 minutes ago. The good news is you've heard from a lot of folks today who have said basically what I wrote in my presentation. And so they're making it easy on me. Thank you, Potter, for a generous introduction, and I hope I can live up to it. Again, I'm Josh Soslak. I'm the Senior Advisor for Infrastructure Resilience to the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And thank you to Bill and Kristen and the Institute for asking me to come today. The subject of this conference, climate change and infrastructure, is very important, and one which will only become more relevant as we realize the changes that face our coastal cities and towns, and really across the globe. It's great to be back in Boston. I lived here 20 years ago, and I worked on the Big Dig. I think Richard was actually our client at that point. And I spent several weeks here a couple of years ago talking about infrastructure development with a group of really smart people on the other side of the Charles. One thing I learned in Boston, other than how to speak proper English, is that in the 400 years since John Winthrop stood on the deck of a ship and set the tone for American public discourse, Bostonians have never let the full discussion of any idea suffer from neglect. So what a better place to have this conversation. I was in Houston yesterday, and I went to the Science Museum, and it's not as cool as the one up the road here a little bit, or the little one we have in DC you might have heard of, the Smithsonian. But what the Houston Museum of Natural Science does have is a lot of focus on geology and the physical history of our planet. Not surprisingly, they had a very large exhibit on how oil and gas is formed and the engineering marvels of exploration and production. The section on the creation of oil and gas walks you through 5.5 billion years of the Earth's history and shows you how the planet has changed dramatically. From molten rock and gas to green and full of dinosaurs. And that was about 4.3 billion of it. And the only thing that was constant in that was change. Then about 66 million years ago, a meteor lands in the Yucatan Peninsula, and boom, we're back in the Ice Age. So when we talk about climate change, we're not talking about something new. Rather, our climate has been changing since the Earth was formed. We can argue about the causes of climate change, but nearly every credible scientist on the planet will tell you that it's changing more rapidly because of the carbon we're releasing into the air. I met with one of those scientists last week, actually, at the conference that Jennifer was talking about, and her name's Dr. Deborah Roberts. She's from South Africa, and she was a big part of the International Climate Conference in Durban in 2011 and is very involved in this kind of global discussion. One of the things she said was that even if you found a magic carbon switch and you could just turn off all of the carbon production in the world, not the levels that we've agreed to in the 17 annual meetings and the 18th one that's going on in Warsaw right now. I mean, turn it off. Cold turkey, zero. Even if we were able to do that, we would still spend the next decades and possibly centuries dealing with the fact that there are more than 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Now, that's the highest level in, Dr. Rana is going to correct me on this one, I think it's like 20 million years by some estimates as to how long it's taken. But let's bring it back to our own time scale. In the 30s, the number was a little over 300. So we've basically, in the 60s, it was a little over 300. So we've gone up about 33% in 50 years. It's a big number, and we got to start dealing with it. Now, one last funny thing from Houston, in all those exhibits in the Science Museum, not one of them talked about the impacts on the rate and severity of climate change by humans. There was, however, one sign that pointed out that the major sponsors of the Weiss Energy Hall were, wait for it, BP, ExxonMobil, Conoco, Chevron, the list goes on. And I know you're all shocked by that. But let's move a little closer to home. It's been a year since the storm we call Sandy came ashore in New Jersey. You can call this Hurricane Sandy, you can call it Superstorm Sandy, you can call it, whatever. I think tropical cyclonic event is the proper NOAA term for it. But what it really was big. It was big, and the reality of a storm like Sandy is that storm will never happen again. I think we heard that this morning, that storm. But what will happen is that we will continue to face these threats. And we don't know what the next storm will look like. We don't have a magic ball. We're pretty good at predicting what storms look like about 72 hours out. And as we get into 24 hours, we can kind of tell you where it is. But this is really the point is we can't do future projection perfectly. We can tell you a lot, and we need to have a toolkit to do with that. So let me move on and really look at this issue of resilience. Because when we think about the response piece of this, and let me tell you, the disaster responders, the first responders who do this, FEMA, other federal agencies, state and local guys, private sector, they are the real heroes. They save lives, and they did so during Sandy. And you only need to look at the news coming out of the Philippines to understand how bad it could have been. Horrible, horrible things going on there. And what we realize is that we've gotten pretty good at responding to these storms. Where we need the help and where we really need to focus is on the kind of long-term recovery and rebuilding. So in recognition of that fact, President Obama issued an executive order on December 7th to create the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. And he asked HUD Secretary Sean Donovan to chair it. And the task force brought cabinet-level leadership to this issue, and they were supported by agency staff from across government, and they even brought a few people back into government from the outside. And the task force worked at all levels of government, and it actually worked with private sector and philanthropic interests as well. In August, we actually issued a strategy report for Hurricane Sandy to the president, and then we did the weirdest thing in government. We actually just shut the task force down and sunset it on September 30th. It does not exist anymore. And we had 69 recommendations as part of the task force report, and each one of those went to an agency or agencies for implementation. But as part of developing that report, we talked to the Dutch, we talked to the British, the Chileans, lots of experts from Boston to San Diego. I'm glad you got to hear from Dale today. One of Dale's colleagues, Hank Ovink, works with us on the task force and now at HUD. And what Hank often reminds me is that the Dutch have made a lot of mistakes in their time in dealing with these issues, and we should learn from their mistakes, not make them again. We can also learn from their successes because they've had a lot of success. I was actually in the Netherlands last month, and it was raining the entire time, but I got to look at a lot of the very interesting both climate and also stormwater management issues. The guy who was taking me around in Rotterdam was so excited because the water parks were actually filling up with water. And he said, I take people and I show them this and they don't get it. And you can actually see the water in there. See that bridge, that's a park, but now the road is okay. So the Chileans were very interesting. They have a seismic threat on the order of the Japanese. And we hear a lot about Japan because it's in the northern hemisphere and we don't hear that much about the southern hemisphere, but Chile is kind of the opposite end of the ring of fire. And if you think that 14 feet of storm surge is bad, tsunamis are pretty serious, and that's part of the threat that they're dealing with. And when you add sea level rise into that, it really exacerbates that threat. So the first and foremost lesson of the task force is that regardless of the probability of a Sandy-type storm happening in the mid-Atlantic again, we are at risk from severe weather, and the risk is increasing due to climate change and development patterns. We ignore this fact at our peril. We can argue about the causes of climate change until the cows come home. But the facts, that the sea is rising, that the land is subsiding, and that more people are living in flood-prone areas are just that, facts. Now, personally, I'm putting my money on the room full of Nobel laureates who talk about what caused climate change, but you make your own decision on that one. The second key finding is that we cannot afford to wait for a disaster to build resilience into our physical and social infrastructure. Recovery is a game of catch-up. You've already lost when you start. We need to build resilience, now I can't talk, into our homes, our facilities, and our systems before disaster strikes. When you read the Sandy Strategy Report, and I hope you will, it's available online on HUD's website as well as a couple of other places, you'll notice a lot of similarities between our findings and recommendation and what's in the President's Climate Action Plan that was also released this summer. And this is not an accident. These two efforts included a lot of the same people. Many of our recommendations from Sandy made sense not just in this region, but also in cities and towns across the entire nation. And November 1st, the President issued another executive order. This time it was to implement the adaptation sections of the climate plan. The executive order established a federal council and a task force of state, local, and tribal officials to help guide this process. And what Jennifer didn't tell you is that her boss, the mayor of Broward County, Kristen Jacobs, was named by the President to this task force because of the leadership that she has brought in Southeast Florida. So they are really leading by example, and we are very excited about that. You know, this is a shift for us to be kind of proactive on climate issues, but it's really consistent with how we do things. I think the President said it best in his speech in June at Georgetown when he said, "Americans are not a people who look backward. We're a people who look forward. We're not a people who fear what the future holds. We shape it. What we need in this fight are citizens who will stand up and speak up and compel us to do what the moment demands." I see no better example than looking around this room and sitting in that chair all day. You're telling us we have to do this, and we hear you. Let me switch back to Sandy for a second. So 69 recommendations, a third of them focus on resilience and infrastructure. They include setting for the first time ever a single federal flood risk standard for rebuilding that recognizes climate change. All federal agencies funding Sandy recovery adopted this minimum standard. It's best available data plus 1 foot of freeboard. And understand this is a minimum. We are not saying this is the perfect thing for infrastructure. What we're saying is you're not going to get any money for significant rebuilding or new construction unless you meet this minimum standard. What we did is we developed a set of infrastructure guidelines to help guide the infrastructure piece because there's no silver bullet there. And the guidelines apply to projects that the agencies are doing themselves, like the Corps and the Park Service, and also projects that are being funded through grants, cooperative agreements, partnerships by FEMA, HUD, DOT, EPA, any number of other agencies. There's 7 of these guidelines. They're in the report, page 50. They include issues such as comprehensive risk analysis. You've heard a lot about that today. Regional cooperation and coordination and planning. You've heard a lot about that today. Efficacy and fiscal responsibility, sustainability. We've got to be able to maintain what we build. Acknowledging the inherent uncertainty in predictive analysis. This is a big point because, you know, there is, I think we're getting to the point where we're not talking about is there climate change or is there not climate change, but we are still talking about how much there is. And there's uncertainty in that, and you have to be able to deal with that. I think you know, Jennifer talked a little bit about how they bracketed it. HUD is involved in this because the single largest piece of the Sandy funding, about $15.2 billion net sequestration, is going out through the Community Development Block Grant Program. And to tie back to something that Garrett said earlier, that money goes to state and local governments to do what they think is the most important thing. CDBG is really about helping communities make decisions and helping communities fund the decisions that they make. In addition to New York City, we also, in addition to the Southeast Florida, New York City, Cynthia talked about that this morning. You know, they really started this process long before Sandy through the climate policies that they had. They incorporated that into Plan YC, which is